explain the role of the geographical factors and towards the development of the ancient India. Explain approach. Introduction defines what is the means and why the geographical factors and body. Write about the geographical landscapes of the ancient India. Write about the role of the geographical factors in the development of ancient India. Conclusion. Give and the appropriated conclusion in this and the regards. In the study of the historical development, geographical factors and refers to the physical features and climates and the natural resources of other regions that influence the lifestyle, cultures and economically development of its the inhabitant. And in the context of the ancient India are the vast and of diverse and land, thus the geographical attribution played a the vital role in the shaping the development civilization body. Understanding the geographical landscapes of the ancient India physical features and mountains and the Himalayas mountains and range not only and the sub as are the forbidden and the formidables and natural barriers and safeguarding the inhabitant and of the Indians and subcontinental from the invasions, and but also play other crucial roles in and the defining the climates of the regions. And for example, Himalayas mountain range and acted as other protective shield and against the invasions and such as and the Mongols incursions and in the 13th century regions. The potential rivers and curve the west rivers valley and that and the Harbours and ancient Indian civilization. Thus the rivers and not only the provided and fertility soil and ideals for the agriculture but also the facilitated trade and the transportation, and for the extent the Ganga's floodplain and serve as the cradles and of the civilizations and plain the Indo and the Gangetic plain and formed by the rivers and deposits the fostered and the agrarians and society which grew to the forms the backbone of the ancient Indian civilization. This land and was the rich and the alluvials and the soils and which was also ideal for the cultivating other wide varieties of the crop including fruits and the vegetables. The third desert and the molded and the way of life and for the communities that the resided and there's the diverse desert region and dictated and the establishment of the special trade and route and the encourages the caravans and trade climates and the monsoons. The Indian monsoons are the phenomenon of seasonal and the reversing and winds and broad and abundant rain and which were the centrals to the culturals and for the instant and the anticipations of monsoon and led and to other deep and the rooted agriculture's calendars and practices. This stating the sowing and harvesting period, temperature variations, and ancient India's experience are the wide ranges of temperature variations and for ancient India experience and wide ranges of temperature variation from the cold region of the Himalayas and to the hot Thar desert and the coastal areas and with the moderate climates. For instead and the temperature varies and has an immense and role in the influences the diverse agricultural practices and dietary habits of different region. Role of geographical factors in development of ancient India economically development agriculture and the Indus and the Ganges rivers and provided and fertility lands and which supported cultivated of a variety of crops including carols, pulses and vegetables and pavings the ways and for other surplus production and that not only and the suffered and for the local consumption and but also becomes other sustainable sources of trade. For example, different ancient civilizations and settles near the rivers and basins like the Neolithical sites and such as the Burja homes and the Gufkral and the Simthans and the Jammu and Kashmir. Trade and commerce. The coastal regions and enables maritime and trade and the fostering and relations and with the ancient civilization like the Mesopotamians and Egypt and giving rise to the rich port and such as the Lothals and the Dwarkas and in the ancient India, for examples, and the mountain passes and such as the Jelepla served and as the conduct and for the silk and road and socio-political development and formations of kingdoms and empires and certain region marked by the rich and the natural resources and proximity to rivers, for instance, and the availability of rivers and minerals and near the southern borders provided the advancement of Ganga state and like the Mauryans and Gupta empire utilization, urbanization and cities and the situated strategically and near the rivers banks facilitated economically and activities and such as the trade and agriculture, for examples, and Lothal and Mohenjo-daro etc. Cultural development reason and the philosophical the scenarios and surroundings for the of the Indian and the subcontinental forest areas, deep physiographical interpretations giving birth and to the religious such as the Hindus and the Buddhism. Art and architecture, the abundant and the natural resources influences the art and the architecture of the ancient India with stones, marbles and metals and being the used intensively in the creation of the timeless and sculptures and the magnificent and structures and with the style influences by the bearings and the geographical features. Religious development worship. Rivers basin makes thus them and feel that the natures and worships like the Ganga, Indus, etc. Conclusion. Geographical factor had a wide role in the ensuring the wide ranges of the cultural growth and from the food and the pattern to the settlement and pattern and creating other civilizations and full of the varieties and the complexities, and this shows and that the geographical features of ancient India and were the crucial in shaping one of the world's oldest civilizations. What was the different and the between Mahatma Gandhi and the Rabindranath Tagore in their approach towards the education and the nationalism approach? Introduction. Write about the Mahatma Gandhi and the Rabindranath Tagore and briefly body. Write the difference between the Mahatma Gandhi and Rabindranath Tagore and their the approach towards the education and write and the different different between and the Mahatma Gandhi and Rabindranath Tagore and their the approach toward the nationalism conclusion and give and the appropriated conclusion in this regard. Introduction. Mahatma Gandhi and Rabindranath Tagore were to the style and words in Indian history and the carving out and the distinct path in the national freedom struggles and the societal development, and while the Gandhiji led India to independence through non-violent civil and disobedient, and Rabindranath Tagore, the first and the non-Europeans and novels, the literate, provided other robust intellectuals and foundations and for the emergence nation body. And difference between the Mahatma Gandhi and Rabindranath Tagore in their the approach and towards education aspect. Philosophical education should be the practiced and focus on the historicals and development emphasis moral values and belief in the more and the flexible creating and the globalization approach to education focusing on the harmonic and the development of the human beings. Curriculums and advocated and for the craft and the centered education and that would and the encourages self and the sufficient and in the corporated vocational trainings and in envisioned and the education system and that the fosters creativity and thought arts and music and dance. Teaching method preferences and hand-on teachings and method to cultivate a sense of the dignity of labors, encourages open and the environment and even the open air classes to nurtures the natural curiosities of student institutions, stabilized and basic the educations and institution and grounded on and the philosophies of Nai and the Jalim and founded the Shanti Niketans and the institutions and where the learning was closely and integrated and with the natures and arts. Global influences less concern and with and the allegianizing the education system and with the global trades advocated for and the educations that is in and the tough and with and the global movement and enrichment and once the understanding of the world focus. Education should be the more individual centrics and the armed it and the characters buildings. Focus was on and the nurturing and universals and human's values and fostering a deep appreciation for the interconnectedness and of all beings. Language and Gandhiji and focused on use of the vernacular language and for the education in early state focus on the use of the English language as the global movement. Different between the Mahatma Gandhi and Rabindranath Tagore in their the approach toward the nationalism aspect. Mahatma Gandhi and Rabindranath Tagore perspective on the unity advocated and for other united India's and upcomings overcoming overcoming reasons and the communal divided. Rabindranath Tagore had reservations and about the instance and nationalism and promoting other more and universal brotherhood and means to achieve freedom, leverages and non-violent civil disobedient movements and the non-cooperation movement and criticize and the aggressive and the nationalism movements and the preference are the path of the self and awareness and reasonings and view on the western influences often the criticals of the western influences civilization emphasizing on the swaraj or self rules and had other more and the accommodative and views of the west and embracing modern and the progressive ideals and while the maintaining the critical stand role in freedom's struggles and activities led the movement and the mobilizing message and for other collective goals maintained the more and philosophical and educational standard and nurturing other space and for the intellectual discard perspective on the cultures and promoted the Swadeshi and the encourages indigenous and cultures and production appreciated and universal values and encourages the synthetics of the different cultures and the fostering international harmonies. Visions 4 post and the independence India and the envisioned the self and the sufficient villages economic grounded in non-violence inspired and for other national and with other rich cultural and the tapestry and nutrishing by the education and the universals education and universals and the value. Both Gandhi and Tagore and aware and the monumental figures in the Indian history and crafting and the divergence path and towards the development of society and education and there the effort had have and the sculptures the Indian education and landscapes and the societal norms and to other large and extended living other profound impact on the national asset. And question third, bridge out the socio-economically effect of the introduction of the railways in different countries and of the world. Answer. Introduction. Write about the history of the introduction of the railways globally briefly body and write about its the socio-economically effect in development countries. Writes about its ये टीवी की आवाज़ तनक कम कर दियो. Write about its the socio-economically effect in developing countries and the conclusion. Give appropriate conclusion in this regard. Introduction. Railways have played other vital and role in shaping the socio-economically landscapes of various countries and since their the inceptions in the early 19th century and with the UK spear and headings its the development the rail and network can not only the facilitate domestics and growth but also the become an instrument in exciting and the colonials and the strategics and the drastically and altering the dynamics in the regions and like the India's and Africa's and socio-economically effect in development countries and positive impact. Urbanization, the emergence of the iconics and stations like Grand and centers in New York and fosters urban and the development and the birthd and sovereign in the USA, enhancing the regional connectivity and imbalance in bettings. Cities like London, two major hubs of activities. employment. Railways birthed and new the professions and with the roles and ranging from the station master to the engineers, and significant boosting employment and opportunities, especially during the construction of monumentals and projects like the US and the Transcontinental Railroad and the culture exchanges, the Oriented exchanges and the connecting Paris and to the Constantinople and served as the significant culturals and bridge and the fosterings and the exchanges of ideas and traditions, and in enhancing and the understandings the among the diverse society, and negative impact environmental degradations. Railways have the historical poses and environmental challenges and with the project and like the channels tunnels and between and the UK and the France facing the criticism and for the potential and the adverse impact on marine and ecosystem, socio-economics and the disparities and development such as the San Francisco Bay Areas and BART and system has been criticism and for the exacerbating and the gentrifications and skatings and property prices in urban hubs. Socio-economically impact in the developing and countries and positive impact economic growth in Africa and national railways and fostering economic growth by the enhancing trade and commerce. For example, the Kenya's Uganda's railways and promoting the business and activities and the international trade and social and the mobilities. Railways brought and the considerations and tribal and social benefits and to the South Asian countries, including the Indias, and where the initiative like the Lifelines Express and the providing medicals and the services and to the remote communities and community buildings. The Trans and the Siberian Railway spanning across the Russias and play a crucial role in the connecting together remote areas and fostering national unity and community integration. Negative impact resources exploitations rail networks and like the British colonial railways in India's and facilitated and easy and the transportations of raw material to ports for exports and the several hunterings, the growth of the local industries and the displacement of communities and the numerous and the communities faced and the discharges faced the discharges face and the safety issues and due to the indicated infrastructure seen with the tragic indicated like and the Gessels train disaster 1999 in India's and underlying the urgent need and for the improved safety and the measurement. Conclusion. The introduction of the railway globally has been other double and edge and the S-words and promoting the socio and the economically growth while the presenting consideration challenges. As we the envisions the future's ecosystem development like the hyper loops, it is the imperative and to forge path and that the ensure safety and the sustainable growth. Question number 4. Discuss the consequences of the climates and changes on the food and securities in the tropical countries and introduction. Write about the history of the introduction of the railway globally briefly and write about its and the socio-economical effect in development countries. Write about and its and the socio-economically impact in developing countries. Conclusion. Give appropriations conclusion in this and the regards. Introductions. Climate change and marked by the endurance and alterations in temperatures and the precipitations and weather patterns and has the resulted in other significant average temperatures and rise of the 0.8 degrees and the Celsius per decades and seen the 1880 and as the documented and in the NOAA's and 2021 annual climate report, and thus the transformation have and the profound implications for food security and especially in the tropicals and the countries and body. Negative and the consequences of the climate changes on the food security in the tropical countries. Change in the temperatures and in the tropical season, additionally warming compounds and heat and the stress on the crops and further the reducing the productivity and the joy and the paradising and food security for extended The wheat and crops in India was significantly impacted by the heat stress and crises and the unprecedented and the temperature surge that the began in and the mid-March 2022. Alteration and precipitations pattern and climate changes and disruption rainfalls and patterns signs and the food and the shortage in tropical countries. For instance, and according to the IPCC and special report on global warming and earth land areas and will and also be affected by the floodings and the increased and runoff and heavy the rainfall from the tropical cyclone is projected and to be the highest effect on and the social and the equalities and the changes in temperature and precipitation affect soil qualities and fertilities and the reducing the agriculture productivity and making it's the changing to produce the sufficient and food and for the growing population. Changing weather patterns and climate change and the implies and extreme the weather events in the tropical countries and the causing and the severe damage to crops and the disruptions and the food and the distributions and for examples India and the experiences a total loss of 5.04 and the millions and the hectares of crop areas and due to cyclonic storms and landslide and flood, regular floods and the cloud burst and up and the untils and November 25 2021 crop and the vulnerabilities and pest and climate changes increase the sustainabilities and of the crops and to the pest and diseases and endangering and food security by the reducing crop yield and for the instance since the beginnings of the January 2020 and best the groups of the desired and locust have and the influences harm on the over 20,000 hectares of farms land in Ethiopia. Diversity loss, climate changes and worsens diversity loss, impacting the ecosystem and the availabilities of wind foods and this the directly affected tropical communities and heavily and the rally this the heavily and the rally on thus the resources for the sustainables and income heightening the risk of the food and insecurity. For example, the loss of the honey bees and the driven by the climate changes will lead and to other strong storage of food crops and including the fruits and vegetables and nuts and the oilseed and as they are and the crucials and pollinators. Positive consequences of climate changes on the food and securities in tropical regions. Longer growing and seasons in some and the tropical regions and rising the temperature can extend the growing seasons and for insurance in part of the sub-Saharan Africa and warmers the temperatures and have the enabled farmers to cultivate multiple crops and annuals instead of just one and this the increased agriculture productivity can the contribute significantly to the food and the security increase CO2 and levels and elevated levels of carbon dioxide can enhance the photosynthesis leading to the higher crops and yield. For instance, and studies have shown and that the crops and like the rice and the wheat and which are staples and the many and tropical countries and can the benefits and from the increased CO2 and the concentrations and potentials boosting food and productions expansions of the Arabans and for instance improvement crop varieties for example enhances fisheries for instance expansion of Arabian land. रुक जा higher temperature and the altered and the precipitations patterns and can make the previously and inhospitable and areas suitable for agriculture. For instance, in some parts of the Andes and the Sahan and changing the climate condition and have the allowed and for the cultivations of new crops and varieties that were the previously and not the visible in thus the regions. Improve crop varieties and climate changes and has and the supported and the resources into the developing crops and varieties and that are more and the resiliences to the changes changing condition, and for example drought and the resistance and mild and the heat and tolerant rice the varieties and has been and the developed, enhancing food securities in regions like the southern areas, Southeast Asia's and West Africa's, enhances the fisheries and warmer oceans and temperatures can shift and fish and the population, making them more and the abundant in the certain tropical coastal areas and for extended the country and such as the Indonesias and Philippines and has the reported increased and fish the catches in the region and where's the warmer and waters and has and the attracted and more the marine life. Conclusion, consequences the climates and changes on food securities in the tropical countries and are the profound and the multifaceted, and while the climate changes and poses other significant threat to the food security in thus the regions, it also and the presented of the some opportunities होती हैं for adaptations and the innovations के लिए एक comprehensive approach रहती है and the compassing and the mitigations adaptation and the stakeholder collaborations is essential to ensure the food secures and the sustainable and futures in tropical region. Why is the world and today and the confronted and with the crisis of the availability of and access to the fresh water resources. Productions and start the briefly and with the status of the fresh water resources in the world and body motions and reasons and behind the crisis of the availability of the fresh water resources and mention the reasons and behind the crisis of the access to fresh waters and resources and the conclusion. Give appropriation conclusion in this the regard. Introduction. Fresh water resources encompasses रहते हैं naturally occurring the low salt water sources clear lakes, rivers, lakes and groundwaters and the glacier, serving vitals and humans and needs and such as the drinking, irrigation, industries and the ecologically stabilities. And however, according to WWF, about 1.1 billion and lakes the consistent access to clean the drinking waters and the roughly and 2.7 billion and the grave pulse with and the recurring and water and the scarcities and vividly and highlighting the crisis in and the fresh water availability and access body reasons behind the crisis of the availability of the fresh water resources and the growing demand wells and the limited supply the world and the populations and is as why is the world and today and the confrontation and with the crisis of the availability of and the access to the fresh water resources. Answer. Approach. Introduction. Start briefly and with the status of the fresh water resources in the world and body. Mention the resources behind the crisis of the availability of the fresh water resources. Mention the reason and behind the crisis of the access and to the fresh water resources and the conclusion. Give appropriation conclusion in this regard. Introduction. Fresh water resources encompass and the naturally occurring and low salt water resources and like the rivers, lakes and groundwater and glaciers serving vitals humans needs such as the drinking, irrigation, industries and ecological stabilities. However, according to the WWF, and about 1.1 billion lake of the consistent access to clean drinking water and roughly the 2.7 billion and graphs and with the recurring and water scarcity and vividly highlighted the crisis at fresh water availability and access body reasons and behind the crisis of the availability of the fresh water resources and growing the demands and whereas the limited and supply and the world and the population is on the continuous and rise and with and the projections and indicating and the increase of the nearly and 2 billion pupils and over the next 30 years and leading to the surge and in the demands for fresh water resources and while the availability supply and remains the relatively and the constant. Climate change and the altered and the precipitations patterns and climate changes is increasing and shifted in the weather patterns leading to unpredictables and rainfalls and prolonged and droughts in certain region and this the disruptions and the natural and the replenishment and of the fresh water resources. For instance, in the August 2023 India experiences and the extraordinary shortfalls in the rainfalls and amounting to the 36% and below the normal levels over extractions and the depletions of the aquifers, and many the reasons and are the over pumpings groundwater faster than it can be and the naturally and the replaced and leading to the depletions of the aquifers, and which are the critical resources of fresh water. For extended in the current and patterns and persistence, it is and the projected and that the approximately 60% of India and the aquifers and will be in the critical state within the next 2 decades, and the population and the contaminations and the industrials, agricultures and the domestics and activities and release population into the fresh water resources and making thus and the insurables and for the consumptions and others the critical uses. For instance, and the World Banks and reported that over the 80% of the waste waters in developing the countries is and discharges into the rivers and the lakes and without the treatment, leading to the populations and inefficiency and water management, inadequate and infrastructures for water storage and treatment and the distribution, as well as the wasteful irrigation and practices and contribution to the efficiency use of the available fresh water resources. And for the instance, an important and the and improperly and the maintained and the operations and automatically landscapes irrigation system in other household has other potentials of the scoundrels approximately 25,000 and the gallons of water each year, and reasons behind the crisis of access to the fresh water resources. Inadequate infrastructures, many reasons and lack the necessary infrastructures to provide karta fresh water to their population, and particularly in rural and the marginalized communities. For example, even though and the Democratic Republics of Congo and the possesses a large and the shares of the Africa's and water resources, its lakes and access to the potables and water economic and the disparities in many and the parts of the world and the low incomes and the communities struggles to afford the cost of the water services. And for the instance, in urban slums of the Mumbai, India, and the thousands of the families are formed to rely on the limited and often and the contamination water resources due to the high prices of the clean waters and political and the social conflicts and disputes and over the water rights and within and the countries and between and the neighboring nations, and can lead to the restricted access to share water resources. For example, the encouraging conflict between the Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt and over the Grand and Ethiopia's and Renaissance Dam on the Nile rivers, and natural disaster and the conflicts and the natural disasters and such as the flood and the earthquakes and the conflict and can the disrupted and water infrastructures, leading to restricted and access to the fresh waters and lack of the education and the awareness, limited and understandings of the water hygiene and the conservations and the practices, and hinders and effort to improve access to the fresh water in the certain community. Conclusion on the urgencies and of the addressing the crisis of the availability and the access to fresh water cannot be overstand and the considering the vital role of the fresh water in standard life ecosystem and the socio-economically development by the importance the promotion the proposed and the solution and foresting the collaborations and amongst the nations and communities beacon and the string for other futures, and where's the clean and accessible fresh water is available to all, thereby ensuring the well-being and the sustainability of our the planets. How are the fjord and formed, and how do they and the constituted some of the most and the pictures and areas of the world, and the answer introductions. Start with basic introductions of fjord and bodies and motion, the formations of the fjord. Mention reasons and why the fjord constitute and some of the most and the picturesque areas in the world. Conclusion, give appropriate and the conclusion in this regards. Introduction. The fjord and is the narrow and deep and the intel and of the sea water and the borders and by the steep and the cliffs and over the mountains and extending the inland and for the oceans. An example of the fjord and include the Sognefjord and Geirangerfjord and the Lies Fjord. Thus the naturals and wonder boost unique and the geographical features and the rich biodiversity and the cultural important body formation of the fjords and the glacier erosions glacier and the fjords and took and the shapes and during the ice ages and the when massive glaciers cups out the deep u-shaped and valley as they the moved and eroding the landscapes. For instance, and the Norway and snowfall and was created through this and the glacier activities and North America, South America, Africa, Asia, Europe, Ocean and the Switzerland, Greenland, Azerbaijan, Isotratics and the reward and as and the glaciers as glaciers and advance and the way down and the earth crust and the land shrinks or the subsidies and under the pressures and when the glaciers and retired and the crust and slowly and the reverts or the rises in the response and creating the fjord and characteristic deep and the narrow shapes. For example, the Dramens Jordans. Sea levels rise and rising the sea levels and often the associated with the meltings of glaciers and the end of the ice and ages and leads to the submersion of the glaciers. Carved a valley and this and the submersion field. Sea water forming the For example, Milliford and Sound flood in and the New Zealand was formed करता है and when the sea and the induced in the glacier valley and tectonic activities and fjord can also and from due to the tectonic activities where the earth crust and the undergoes and vertical movement causing the land and to the sinks and the allowing and the sea waters to enters the creating and the fjord and reasons why the fjord and the constitutions and some of the most and the pictures and areas in the world and standing and the geologicals and formations and fjord are the characteristic why there's the unique and the pictorials and geographical formations and including the deep narrows and inletted and the steeps and climbed inletted and the steep and clipped and U-shaped and valley and the creating the visually and the streaking landscapes. For example, the Tracy and Arms and the fjord in Alaska, USA. Constructed of the elements and the fjord offers a the captivating contrast between the towerings and the rocky and cliff and the scenarios and deep the blue waters and this and the juxtapositions of elements creates the visuality arresting and the harmonious landscapes and for example and the Geirangerfjord and in the Norway and Tungkjul and the remotes and ambiences and Ford the evokes and the sense of the terrain qualities and the remoteness and with their the scheduled and locations and claims the water providings and the ideals and atmosphere for relaxations and the contemplations and for examples the Fjord rich biodiversity and fjord and the supported and the diverse and ecosystem and both the above and below the waters and the surface and with various and floras and faunas and including the marine life and the world species enhancing there's the naturals and appeals. For instance, the fjord in the western Antarctica and peninsula are the extended hotspots of the pelagics and the benthics and the productivity and the biodiversity interplay of light and waters and the landscapes and the fjord offer other dynamic interplay of the natural elements and the play of the life on the water surface and the reflected of the towerings and cliffs and evers, changing weather the condition and creating other captivating and even evers and the involving the visuals and spectacles. For example, Alaska glaciers, which conclusion for fjord and are the incredibly and unique and the visually and the captivating and the geographical features on Earth and the shaped and through the diverse and natural process. And nevertheless, and thus the natural wonders and are the currently under threat from the climate changes and by the fostering collective efforts and we can work and towards the securing and there's the extended and for the future generations. Question number 7. Why is the south and west monsoon called the Purvaya and the easterly and in the Bhojpur regions? And how has this and the directionals and the seasonals and wind system influences the cultures and ethos of the region? Question number 7. Why is the southwest monsoon and called the Purvaya and the easterly in Bhojpur regions and how has and this the directions and seasonals and wind systems and influences the culture ethos of the regions? Answer. Approach. An introduction. Write about the southwest monsoon and its and the nomenclatures and around the various regions and body. Mention reasons and behind the calling the southwest monsoon and the Purvayas and the easterly in the Bhojpurs and regions and influences of the directional seasonals and wind systems and on the cultural ethos and of the regions and conclusion give and the appropriations in conclusions. In this regard, an introduction. The southwest monsoon is other seasonal wind systems and that the typically and the originated and from the southwest direction and the brings and heavy and the rainfall during the summers and months and thus and the significantly impacting the socio-economics and landscapes of the Indian and the subcontinental. It is and the recognized by the various and names and across Indias and such as the Varshas and Ritu in Hindis and the Idavapathi and in and the Malayalams and in the Bhojpur regions and it is the referred and to as and the Purvaya and the easterly and owings to the following regions body. Southwest region in India. Body and the reason behind the calling the southwest monsoon Purva and the easterly Bhojpur in region in India. Geographical orientation. The Bhojpur regions and which is located in the eastern and part of the India and the experiences the southwest monsoon and wild and comings and from the Bay of the Bengals and thus the points and blow in from and the east and which is why and they are the preferred and to as and the Purvaya and meanings wind. From the cast. Historical influence. The use of the terms and the Purvayas and may have and the historical roots and where the local and the communities and the cultures and developed and there's the our names and for the weather's phenomena and based on their the observations and the experience over time. Thus names and becomes the in or ingrained and in and the local cultures and the language and linguistics and the influences. Purvaya and originated and from the Hindi and the language and since the spoken Bhojpuri is significantly influences by the Hindi it has and the adapted these terms influences of the directional and seasonal wind system on the culturals and the ethos of the regions. Cropping. The southwest monsoon and the determine the cropping and calendars and of the Bhojpur regions and farmers eagerly and await and its and the arrivals and to the begin and plantings various crops and including and the stempled and likes the rice and the wheats and rituals like the kheti badi and the celebrates and this the crucial event emphasizing the close and relationship between the agriculture and the monsoon attire Traditional clothing in Bhojpur is designed to the widespread and the monsoon weathers and with the light weightings and breathable and fabric chooses to the provided comfort during the heavy rain. And for instance, men often wear the dohitis and the kurtas, and while the women prefers and saris. And folk the songs and the music in Bhojpur and the folk songs and the music often the celebrates and the arrivals and of the monsoon and highlighting the joys and reliefs brought by the monsoon rain. And festivals like the Tej and fairs like the Chetis and Melas are the time with the monsoon show casting the deep cultural significance of rain and in the Bhojpuri regions, and thus the events and often the features and the processions and dances and the performance and that the celebrated the regions and cultures and biodiversities in facing the importance of the monsoon in the local culture ethos, language and the literature, the seasonals and wind and system and its impact on the climates and the natures and subs as the prominence themes in the Bhojpuri language and literatures and poems, the Baras Jait Pani exemplify this. Purva encapsulated the spirit of the Bhojpur and regions and where the monsoon is not just other weather's pattern and but other cultural head beat. It is the underscore and the resiliences and the adaptabilities of its and the pupils and served as other reminder of the enduring relationship between the natures and the cultures in this remarkable part of India. Question number 8. Do you think marriage as other sacrament and is and looking its the values in modern India's answer? Introduction. Briefly introduced and marriage as other secret institute. Right, how the marriage as other sacrament is losing its the value in modern India. Right, various counters argument giving the against these views. Right, and suitable way heed conclusion give and the appropriation conclusion in this regard. Introduction. In India's marriage is the traditionally and seen as other sacrament, the sacred and the institution and stipulated in the regions and the culturals and significant and this the understandings of the marriages and hold it as an unbreakables and the bond and forged and not just and the between and two individuals and but also and their the families bodies. Reduced and the sacramentals and values of the marriages in modern India in increasingly diverse and rate according to the 2011 census and 13.6 and lack the industrials individuals and where the divorce and equivalent to 0.24% of the marriage population and 0.11% of the total population. Delayed and the marriages as per the NFHS and 5 and the married mediums. Age of first marriages among the women and 20 से लेकर के 49 years of ages and has increased by the 2.0 years and during the last decades and other halves and from levels of the 17.2 years and in the 2005 2006 and to the 19.2 years and in the 2019 and 21 for men ages 25 and 29 and this increased and from the 22.6 and to 24.9 during the same period. In India's marriage is traditionally seen as the sacrament and as the sacred institution stipulated in the religion and the culture significant. This understanding of marriages hold it as an and the under and the breakables and bond and the forget not just and between the two individuals and but also there's the family's body. Reduced and the sacramentals values of the marriages in the modern India increasingly divorce rate according to the 2011 census 13.6% and lack individuals and where the the divorce and equivalent and to 0.24% of the married and populations and 0.11% of the total populations and delay the marriages as per the NFHS 5 and the mediums and age of the first and the marriage and among the women and 20.49% years and of ages has the increased by the 2.1. 2.1 growing expectancy of live in the relationship. They are the cohabitations and agreement and where the unmarried and the coupled and live together without the legals and the religions and the sanctions, and it is the challenges the sensitivity and exclusively and of the marriages and the excrement. Growing consumption marriage and the materialistic it has and the created other culture of the combination and the comparisons and dissatisfactions and among the many and Indians and who seeks the happiness and status through money, and it has affected the expectations and demands of marriages and partners and the leading to conflicts and the dissatisfactions. Casual approach towards the commitment and the rising population of the dating app like the Tinder and the Bumbles and indicated a change in the youth and approach and towards the relationship and fostering and the more and casual attitude towards the dating and the commitment. Individualism and the shift is reflective and of other more broader acceptance of individuals and autonomy and personal and preferences and taking the precedent in maritals and the decisions and illustrating and the transmissions towards other society and where the personal choice and are the valued and more than the age old traditions and counters arguments and factor arguments and why the marriage still is the considered and the sacred in the modern India's and traditional values, regional beliefs and community pressures and government policy, economic consideration, arrangement marriages, traditional values. Many influential families still hold grant and the traditional wedding ceremonies and including other continuous revenues and for the traditional maritime norms, and that has been and the backbone of the Indian marriages. Religious beliefs, place of the religious important like the Tirumalas and are the still sought after the destinations for the wedding, underscoring the individual enduring significance and respect for the secret ceremonies and rituals and in and the Indian marriages and depicting the strong in various part of the community assemblies and the panchayats and play a vital role in the emphasis and the conventionals and pathway of the traditionals and marriages and ran standings the society path in the ages old the practices and the encouraging and adherence to the same government policies, government initiatives like the kanyas and the vivaha and yojanas and standing the testimonies and true and the faced and that the marriages and are the encourages and aid the policy levels and asserting the government and rule in and the fostering tradition, maritime norms and economically consideration in several rural areas and families and the communities on often views marriages and from and the economic lens and whereas in the institution and serve as other means and to the forget economic stabilities and the allowances in facing the necessary and of and the experimentals and marriages for creating economically variables units and arrangement marriages and many the families underlinings the ongoings and the prominent of arrangement and marriages and the and the signatlings the sustained and the preferences for the alliances and fostering the through and the families and network and thereby the acknowledging the weightage and presence of the traditional in matrimonial matters and conclusion. While marriages as other excrement and the undergoings and changes in modern India's and with the bearings degrees of the adherence to the traditional norms and it is the essential to the create other balanced and approach and leveraging the above mean measures and can offers other way and forward and that the respected individuals and choices while the retaining the sanctity and significance of marriages and thus cups thus curving other path at that the respected and the old while and embracing the new. Question number 9. Explain why the suicide and among the youth among the young women is increasingly in Indian society. Answer approach. Write about the increasing society among the young women in Indian society and briefly and body and write why the suicide and among the young women and the increasing in Indian society and write the message to the reduced and the society among the young women in Indian society conclusion and give the appropriate conclusions in this regards and alarming rise in and the suicide and cases among the youngs and women in India and has the become other significant point of the concern. Recent statistics and the indicated and the uncertainties and trend of heightened society and rate among these groups. For instance, according to other study and the public in and the Lancet and India's an account and 4 and the 37% of the global society and death among the women's body. Reason behind the increasing and the society among the आवाज कम कर लिए जा रहा है मोबाइल की. Reason and briefly behind and increasing the society among the young women in the Indian society educational pressures. The case of the educational institutions like the IIT and the others and premier institution recordings and cases of student suicides and including the young women and underlines the diets and needs to the address and the enormous and the pressures and student and the student are under contributing to the rise in society and identities and crisis. The platforms like the Instagrams and has seen and the rise and the influencers emphasizing the body and the prosperities and influencing a identified crisis platform like the Instagrams has been other rise and in the influences and the emphasis body and the positivity indicating other reasons to prevent the body images issues and the identity crisis that many young women and face today and the sometimes leading to extremes and action including the society financial pressures and economic hardships and often the highlighted in the documentaries and news the features and shows the young and women and the succumbing to the overwhelming and pressures. Unemployment despite the being and the highly uneducated many the women and find the stables and the employment and the elusives and the khanda and coaches financial pressure, economic hardships, and often the highlighted in the documentaries and news. The features and show the young and women and the succumbing and to the overwhelmings and pressures to contributed the financials to their the families and fostering the environments and where the suicide rates and are on the rises. Employment and despite the being highly uneducated and many women find an stable in employment. Elusives and Chanda coaches and once other celebrated and bankers highlighted the challenges and women and faces in the professionals world affective there's the mental well-being, unhealthy usage of technologies and the digital ranges. Increasing isolation, although the technology promotes and connectivity, it can and lead to the isolations. The story of the Anayas and Virlas, a young and the entrepreneurships and musician, emphasizes the loneliness and even the successful feel in the tan and driven era and methods enhancing the gentle and health support systems. Counselings and the therapies and services established more and the accessible and mental health services including the in strengthens and the educational and careers opportunity skills development programs and implement and vocational training and skills development programs to increase the employments. For examples, the initiatives like Skill India provide the various and the training programs. Promoting gender equality and women empowerment and legal protections and awareness empowerment programs. इसकी example legal protection and awareness ensures the strict enforcement of law protecting women's rights and conduct awareness and compensations about those rights and empowerment programs and promote the self-help groups and women's collectives that the empowers and women socially and the economically such as the self-help group growth rate in India. Combating and the domestic violence and abuse, the legal supports and the safe houses, domestic violence education interventions and the legal support and safe houses provides the legal and the safe houses and for the victims of the domestics and the violence, the establishment and of the one-stop centers and for the women in distress and can be the strengthened education and the interventions and educate and the communities about the effect and of the domestic violence and provides. Conclusion, it is the battle to foster the society and then the nutrient and support young women and through the systematically changes and that the look and aid the well-beings and of and the individual holistics and taking the inspirations and from the successful stories and the initiatives and globally and nationally. Question number 10.